Hey guys, what's up? Today I'll be ranking every single RPG developed and published by Squaresoft in North America. That's right, Squaresoft, not Square Enix. Alright, we got over 30 games to cover, and please remember this is only my personal opinion. So let's begin! Alright, we're gonna start this list with Saga Frontier. I'm choosing this one as the worst because I personally hate it, but I just want to point out that I don't think it's a bad game. Different protagonists to choose from, each with their own route and allies. That was cool, except I had zero clue what to do or where to go in most of them. If we add the cryptic nature of the Saga games, I think this one might have it worse than others. The early difficulty spikes also made a contribution in my hatred for it. I will give the remaster a try one day, but I'll probably never go back to the original PS1 release. Next up is Secret of Evermore. Despite having a lot of personality and very interesting ideas, I did not like this game one bit. I thought the controls were clunky, the combat was convoluted, and the challenge was weird. Weird as in some enemies were very easy to defeat while others destroyed me in seconds. If we add that there's barely any music sometimes and often I have no idea of what to do, it makes it worse. I also question some of the design choices of it. I have a lot to say about this game, but I'd rather cover it fully in another video. Again, this is not a bad game, it just wasn't for me, I guess. Next is Chocobo's Dungeon 2. Finally a game that I like, but it's alright. We never got the first game, so they gave us a sequel. Fortunately, while it is story related to its predecessor, all Chocobo games are like the Mario games, you can just start with any. This is a roguelike RPG where you explore randomly generated dungeons with Chocobo, you move and the enemy moves, so it's a pretty basic turn-based system. But it's very repetitive and it gets somewhat boring pretty quickly. I think the one on the Wii is much better. Coming up, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I think the soundtrack is the only outstanding feature of this game. It was published in North America first as an RPG for beginners. That pissed off a lot of people. Honestly, it's not a bad game at all. I actually think it's good, but it's just okay. It is precisely a simplified version of any turn-based RPG of its time, and unfortunately, it's pretty generic and forgettable. Next is Threads of Fate. I really wanted to like this little action RPG, but it disappointed me. You can choose between two protagonists and they have their own different missions, story and bosses, so that's a highlight, but most of its ideas were poorly executed. I think the combat was kinda lame, not terrible, just not great, controls weren't that responsive. Grinding is weird, and you gotta put up with that cause you'll even need it to solve some puzzles or go beyond certain areas, and the platforming in 3D, like many games of this early 3D era, was almost destroyed by the camera. It's still a decent game, but I don't think I'll ever finish it. Moving on to Parasite Eve 2. I'm not sure this game should be here cause unlike its predecessor, most of its RPG elements were removed. This one felt more like a survival horror game than anything with weird tank controls. I never understood properly the combat here. I got lost in the elements deciding crucial status factors of Aya Bree. Finally, the pacing was incredibly slow and uninteresting. I don't think it's a bad game per se, but like most RPGs we've seen so far, it's just not great either. Next is Adventures of Mana. Well, this is the very first Seiken Densetsu and it was called Final Fantasy Adventure overseas. I think this is one of those games that for its time, it was great. A very early action RPG, top-down view with charisma. but it's severely outdated. It was remade on the GBA as Sword of Mana and finally, with its real name, on the PS Vita, the latter being the best version to play in my opinion. Moving on to Final Fantasy, the first one. It's a classic, and the game that saved Hironobu Sakaguchi's career, hands the name. He really thought this was gonna be his last game. I can't rank it higher though, because just like Adventures of Mana, classic or not, it's just very dated, with barely any story to keep the player invested, and a simple grind fest that can easily turn you off. I grew up with the NES, but not with this game, so I have no nostalgia for it. PS1 remake called Origins was more fun and intuitive for me. And the next one is gotta be Final Fantasy II. NES version was never released outside Japan until the Origins release I mentioned. I never played the original on the Famicom, but I did give this remake a try. I wasn't the biggest fan either, but I can see its importance in the market. However, it feels more like a saga game than a Final Fantasy, often quite cryptic and a convoluted leveling up system. I'm not sure if I like it more or less than the first one. Next is the Final Fantasy Legend. Actually, this is the first saga game ever made. It was just called Final Fantasy to exploit the name's branding in North America. It's a solid RPG where you select from various classes for your main character and then go on to explore a universe of several worlds around a huge tower. For its time, this game has really interesting lore and exploration, despite some of its gameplay mechanics being also somewhat outdated. The next game is Final Fantasy Legend 3. Out of all the Squaresoft RPGs, this is the only one I didn't have enough time to play properly. What little I played felt like an upgraded version over the previous two, but with time travel mechanics. Your class-based characters go to the past, present and future to chase down the final boss. It's really interesting and that definitely hooked me up, so this one just felt to me better than the first one, that's all. Coming up, Vagrant Story. Vagrant Story is a game I'm not sure if I like it or not. I respect it because it was written by Yasumi Matsuno, whom I think it's an excellent writer, so the story seemed very intriguing, dark and mature. It's the gameplay I'm kinda picky about. It's an action RPG, but you can pause combat to select your next action, being debuffs or buffs, but mainly to target an enemy's part. I think everything is well implemented here, it's just that I suck at it and die easily sometimes. It was just too difficult for me, but it's definitely a good action RPG out there. Next is Saga Frontier 2. Another game that is better than the first one, much better actually. You've probably already noticed I'm not the biggest Saga fan, but this one I liked more than the original. Only two protagonists this time, but I suggest starting with Gustav. It's still kinda cryptic, but nowhere near as the first game. I think this is a harder game too, but with 3 different battle systems, even though they all revolve around classic turn-based. Yeah, this is much better. Next is Brave Fencer Musashi. This one is a fun action RPG where you control only Musashi trying to find a powerful sword. He's on a quest ordered by the princess herself. Yeah, it's a comedy. The game has a night and day clock which alters the enemies, the NPCs and their behavior, so it's really interesting for that. It doesn't have the best controls, but it's better than Threats of Fate in my opinion. It's a charming game, still exclusive to the PS1 by the way. Next is Secret of Mana. I'll confess I'm not the greatest fan of Secret of Mana, but I thought it was much better than the first game. I'm more of a Trials of Mana fan than these two, but that one didn't come out overseas until Collection of Mana on the Switch. I also have no nostalgia whatsoever for this one, but I did like the game more than I expected. I felt it was kinda slow at first, but once you get your party members, it's much more fun. It's very traditional, so don't expect a great story, but for what it's worth, I think it's very charming too. Coming up, Kingdom Hearts. Yeah, the second one was published by Square Enix. Not quite the fan I thought I was of Kingdom Hearts when I first played the second game. I really liked that one, but when I finally got its prequel, I was a little bit disappointed. It was still fun and I made it far and I enjoyed it more than Secret of Mana, that's for sure. It's still a great game, but I just didn't love the combat, so after some spikes in boss fights halfway through, I just quit. Next is Final Fantasy V. Until its release on Final Fantasy Anthology for the PS1, we never got this game before. I think it's a bit underrated in this series. I believe some people stayed away because it's very focused on the job system. It's all about changing jobs frequently, training your characters and finding which one is better for this or that boss. It's tiresome, sure, but it delivers a fun story and characters. I'm personally a big fan of Faris the Pirate. Next on the list, Front Mission 3. Like Vagrant Story, we're talking about targeting parts again, except it's a grid-based strategy RPG where you control mechs, and that's right, you need to break down sometimes an enemy's specific part to stop them from doing more damage or just to kill them, but they can do the same to you and leave you very vulnerable. It's a very challenging game with different routes depending on some really early choices you make. Not sure why we never got the first two games in the series, but we're finally getting the remix of them soon, at least. The first one already had a North American release as a remaster on the DS, just to let you know. Next is Final Fantasy Legend II. I rank this one higher than its two Saga brothers because this is the very first RPG I ever played in my life, so imagine the nostalgia. I think the plot in the third game is more interesting, but I just didn't grow up with it. This one is more charming as your class-based protagonist is looking for their missing father. You can also explore different worlds, some with interesting steampunk ideas. I love this game, but mainly for being an important part of my life. Moving on to Legend of Mana. Legend of Mana is a game that I fell in love with because of the music, the art style, the characters, and its beautiful magical world. It's very quest-driven as opposed to the previous two games. You'll probably need a guide to complete it because it's pretty much an open world game. Combat was fun, multiplayer was fun, and boss fights were epic. This is definitely the best classic action RPG by Squaresoft. Moving on to Final Fantasy IV. We all know this was the first Final Fantasy with a strong focus on its story and characters. In fact, I think that's what stands out the most here with some truly memorable scenes and moments. I think it has one of the best stories ever written for a Final Fantasy game. The gameplay isn't stellar, but it delivers, and I like that sometimes you could have 5 active party members during battle. That was awesome! This one is a timeless classic no matter where you play it. Next is Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm still working on this game because I'm trying to get used to the job system. That's what got a lot of people into it, but I've always been more of a class guy. I prefer characters having only one job the entire game and merely classing up. But the story in this game, man, freaking Matsuno at its best, with something mature, political and tragic instead of trying to save the world with the power of friendship. But I'm a fan of that too, so let's talk about the next game. Which is Final Fantasy X. This was one of the very first RPGs I played on the PS2. I came from the PS1 era, so most of those are ranked higher here though. Tidus was such a lame and dumb character for me that I never really grew attached to him. Half of the party was my problem here as I found most characters uninteresting, too over the top and annoying, except Auron, Lulu and Kimahri. Gameplay wise, it's a really good game, especially its battle system. But it's not really among my favorites in the series. Let's leave it at that. Coming right up, Final Fantasy VIII. Despite its modern destroyed reputation, I'm still a big fan of this game. I never minded the junction system cause I spent my playthrough focusing on the summons like most people out there. If only they had given you a proper leveling up system, Final Fantasy VIII will be a masterpiece. Music, gameplay, story are phenomenal here. Though, just like with Final Fantasy X, I'm not sure about some characters like Selphie or Zell. The rest I love, especially Quistis. I don't give a damn if you don't like her, you can go and kiss my Mexican ass for all I care. Next up, Chrono Trigger. Alright, we're finally entering the real big leagues for me. Trigger was one of the very first JRPGs I played. In fact, I think I went straight to it after finishing Chrono Cross multiple times. But these two games are so different in some areas that I wasn't that impressed with Trigger. I still absolutely loved its music, its characters, and its time travel story focus. Needless to say, this is an ageless classic. Next is Parasite Eve. I already told the story on how this game far surpassed my expectations in another video. I played the second game first, it disappointed me, so I went into this one with negative thoughts. It proved me wrong from the start. I love the graphics, the cinematics, the characters, especially Aya of course, and the battle system. Why change it on the other games when this one was a huge commercial success? I'll never understand. Just walking around during battle and pausing the game just to bring out that range sphere thing or whatever, that was a great gameplay mechanic there. And of course the mix with survival horror, masterfully done. Next on the list, Final Fantasy VII. Another one of my first RPGs ever. Like many of you, I greatly enjoy the story and the characters, its tragic moments and its major plot twists, and the music, oh my god! So I think that and the music is what we fans have in common with this revolutionary RPG. Sure, it's a bit dated nowadays in terms of gameplay, but the memories and the nostalgia is up there, so I can't possibly deny that I love it too. Moving on to Final Fantasy VI. I remember ditching this game after a tutorial boss fight for a character early in the game. Several years later I went back to it and beat it, because I kept feeling it. I kept saying to myself, man, I gotta beat this game, it was great! So this, after all, is a very character-focused RPG, and those are usually the ones I like the most. So Liz was my favorite, and her story arc, including that really heartbreaking scene, was my main reason to love this masterpiece, and I also think the soundtrack is top-notch here. Next up, Xenogears. Xenogears was a very different experience, especially in storytelling back then. It never occurred to me that the same company who was releasing charming RPGs about friendship and magic could delve so deep into philosophy and religion. This is when I learned different people were often working on every Squaresoft game, and I'm glad Xenogears was its own thing above other mainstream titles out there. So the story, and of course that battle system, man, is what really makes this game stand out. Alright, the last three, Super Mario RPG. One more time, nostalgia beats it out of me, and I'm ranking the charm of my RPG life way above others. I think the pacing, the combat and the exploration were a big part of the reason why I loved it. Everything was so intuitive with the right challenge, the perfect balance. Plus back then I had never played nothing like it, so that's another reason why. I covered this game recently, so let's move on to the next one. Number 2, Final Fantasy IX. If it isn't crystal clear by now that this list is based on my personal preferences, I'm not sure you actually watched this video. This is another important title in my RPG life and among the ones responsible for making me such a big fan of the genre. Another game heavily based on the characters above everything else, so of course it was bound to be my favorite Final Fantasy ever. And obviously number 1 is Chrono Cross, absolutely my favorite game of all time. Yeah, you saw that coming. If you were a fan of this channel, you knew this was gonna be my number 1. I really can't wait for the remaster. Is it going to be better than the original? We're gonna have to wait and find out. So that's it, everybody. That was my personal ranking of every single Squaresoft RPG released in North America. There are other games that were released by Squaresoft in Japan, like Unlimited Saga or Final Fantasy X too, but overseas they were released by Square goddamn Enix. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!